mind when you're communicating if there's anything that you want to keep off the record. And if you don't feel comfortable, then feel free to drop now. So my name is Kendall Roden. For those of you who have been around for a while, Dave and myself on the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team at Microsoft started the AKS office hours. And really just the point of these office hours are to provide an opportunity for users of AKS, customers, to get information about updates and other things happening in the cloud native ecosystem in relation to Kubernetes. So we typically do a short talk and a demo related to something that runs on Kubernetes, or a feature, or a feature set, or maybe a new piece of functionality within AKS. And then obviously getting feedback from all of you regarding what you're interested in learning about, but also just other questions related to AKS is a top of mind priority. So in terms of what to expect today, it's going to be a little different. So it's our first bi-monthly AKS roadmap call with the product group. So I know we mentioned this before, and we've been giving you some, I guess, keep this in mind reminders, but essentially every other month we'll be doing one call with the product group where they can kind of talk to us about AKS roadmap, things that are planned, work that's ongoing, and it's a good opportunity for you to ask questions around, what the future state of AKS might look like, or even maybe some of the features and functionality that you care about. So good opportunity to provide feedback. So obviously today is our first in this line of calls, but we'll also have some coming up on May 6th and June 3rd. So I definitely recommend forward this one specifically to your colleagues and to other people you think be interested. And then just wanted to call out, we do have a couple of upcoming sessions we've already set up. So the next session will be Dapper on Kubernetes. And then on April 8th, we'll be talking about Bridge to Kubernetes, essentially the feature that we have baked into Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code to be able to kind of iteratively debug with services that are hosted in Kubernetes running in AKS or in other cloud providers. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to George Palma. So he's a PM on the AKS team, and he'll be leading the session today. So super excited to see what he has to share.
Actually, Michael from my team is going to be leading the session. So I'm not sure if he's joining over.
Yep.
Awesome.
I'm here.
Okay, just saw Michael jump in. Okay, perfect. Great.
All right. Let me pull up the roadmap. Give me 1 second. All right. All right, good. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. All right, so everybody can see my screen, correct?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, great. All right, so essentially I'll start out for what we essentially released from a GA perspective. So we just put out conditional access. So as you look from an identity perspective, we're working hard to complete the identity story from end to end. So conditional access was one of the key capabilities that we got out. So now when you basically have an AAD enabled cluster, now you can basically set conditional access policies for who can actually run kubectl and access the cluster through their AAD capabilities. We've also GA'd our application ingress gateway controller managed add-on. So we're continuing to introduce additional functionality to it, but it is now to a stable point and now basically out in GA for everybody to leverage. As well as that, we've also released our confidential computing VMs. So if anybody's not familiar with confidential computing, essentially think of that as our enclaving-based capability that we have that is native to AKS, which provides an additional layer of security that you can kind of bring in to the environment. That's available with the DC series VMs. Just like I'd mentioned with conditional access, we also have just-in-time access. So for environments that have the PIM integration enabled as well, they can leverage the just-in-time access to even further create further identity-based segmentation for who has access to the AKS cluster. We also been working on a capability around assigning a public IP per node in a NodePool profile. This has been a long-standing capability, but this is now out from a feature-based perspective. We also fixed our clock skewing issue. So the clock skew was detected and been remediated within the AKS cluster environment. So anybody who kind of ran into that issue, that has now been remediated. We also had a policy. We also had a problem with Azure Policy that weren't actually getting the critical add-on only taint. That has now been remediated as well. So any questions on the GA capabilities before I start moving to the left for what we have planned and what we're going to be building out here soon? All right, if anybody doesn't come off mute, I'll keep banging through it. All right. So on the preview side, for anybody that's using private clusters, you've probably run into the challenges with integrating your private DNS, your conditional forwarding, and scaling it out from there. So we have now put into preview the private cluster ByO DNS capability, and so that really completes the DNS structure for integrating your private cluster or integrating your DNS story with your private cluster. As well as that, we've been working hard to make managed identity the default within AKS. And so one of the long-standing limiters to that was the kubelet user-assigned managed identity. That is now in preview as well. And so now, as a default, MSI is now the default when you deploy a cluster. When you look at from a, I kind of talked a little bit about the authorization story with everything we have going on with the identity. We're also working really hard on the authorization side of the house. For anybody who's deployed a cluster, you know by default that the default option when you go into the authentication section is for Kubernetes based RBAC. So on top of that, and so when you look at Kubernetes RBAC, obviously that's providing a least privileged access model to your singular AKS cluster, but we're also working hard to GA Azure RBAC, which is essentially setting your role-based access configuration at the subscription level. So as you're deploying clusters in, they will inherit that role-based access control. We are planning for that to go GA in May for anybody that's looking to leverage that as well. With all of that, right now 1.19 is out. We will be making 1.20 GA by the end of the month. A lot of these scenarios that I'll be talking through today are kind of predicated on 1.20. So we've been working really hard to make that the default, or I should say the GA service, and with that we'll be deprecating 1.17. So as you think about what version of the cluster you're on, just keep that in mind that 1.20 will be coming in and then 1.17 will be rolling out. So on top of all of that, think of all the CSI driver and all the encryption capabilities that we have. We're working hard on that as well. So obviously encryption at rest with BYOK or CMK for your OS and data disks. We also have an Azure policy for that. So there's different capabilities that exist there. We're still working to GA that, but you can actually start playing with that and kicking the tires around those across all your OS and data disks. Another big change for anybody that's running on, if anybody started kicking the tires on 1.20, essentially now Calico has been upgraded from 3.8.9 to 3.17.2. So not only is that moving the functional version of Calico, but that's also making sure it's the latest patched from a vulnerability perspective for that particular image that's running. There's some foundational changes that come with going from 3.8.9 to 3.17.2. The big thing that's there is really about adding the Windows capability in there, but there's some fundamental architectural changes for Calico as you think from 3.8 to 3.17. All right, on top of that, we're working on our next story around CNI, and so there's some different capabilities that we're starting to roll out. And so now AKS allows creation of, well, I'll kind of get into that in a second, but AKS allows creation of node pools and different subnets through Azure CNI. That's one big capability that's coming out. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more as we're going on. As I alluded to earlier as well, for anybody who has a service principal based cluster, you can now basically run an AZ command and then migrate that from a service principal based cluster to a MSI based cluster if you choose to. So we'll be GAing that really, really soon. Pretty much all the bugs are worked out. We've had a couple of AKS issues come on that, but we've worked through those. That's ready to roll over to GA. For anybody who's using static content or doing stateful-based applications and dealing with storage and storage versioning and those kind of things like that, obviously there's a lot of work there about the timing and the functionality. So we've been working on an out-of-tree cloud provider to basically bring in faster innovation and rollout of the storage classes and those kind of things like that. So that's a work in progress as well. And so we've got a really good preview that everybody can start playing with on that front. Support for Ultra SSD, that's another thing as we're bringing in integration with Azure Resource Health, that's out there. I talked about all the private cluster simplifications, so simplified ByO, VNet, and DNS setup, which actually, for anybody that was deploying a private cluster, probably ran into the issue with the timing as far as the BMMS failures around the DNS registration. All of these steps are essentially remediating those particular problems to make that deployment seamless. As I alluded to earlier, with the GA of 1.20, the CSI drivers will all go GA as well. So you'll see all of that move over at the end of the month when that stuff goes GA. Let's see, so what else? So support for custom log options. We're working on support for DSR on Windows AKS when Calico is enabled. Specifically on the Windows front. We're working really hard to add a lot of Windows capabilities. So for anybody that's leveraging Windows on AKS, we are closing a lot of different features, not only from a functional perspective, but starting to add in all the security capabilities. Like I said, Calico was a big release, and there's other things kind of coming in the front. Think Containerd on the horizon, those kind of things like that as well. Standard Skew load balancer does not use own static public IP as outbound type. We're working on that. Once again, so a lot of things coming on that. Use of the same static IP for multiple load balancer types is out as well. And so Azure CNI support for dedicated subnets. That's the CNI VNext that we're kind of working on. A lot of capabilities coming on around CNI. Did I hear somebody getting ready to ask a question? All right, let me keep plugging through. So customized node config. We've heard a lot of feedback around that. We're working on some capabilities around that, but everybody can start kicking the tires on customized node config. And then for anybody who hasn't been playing with this, so obviously we have Pod Identity. So it gives you a better streamlined integration for as you're deploying pods within your AKS cluster, and that pod is having to interface with other resources across the AKS environment or across the Azure environment. Instead of doing your conditional connection string or whatever it might be as far as that integration, you can AAD enable that integration. And so we're actually working on a V2 capability as well to make that even more native, which is based off of OIDC Federation. But right now you can start kicking the tires with our V1 implementation to basically do identity-based integration across your environment. We just published the document on this yesterday around planned maintenance windows as well. So if you want to control how the updates come in, you can basically set planned maintenance windows. And there's obviously the documentation will kind of give you some options for how you set in those maintenance windows. From there, we also have cluster automatic upgrade for your versions. So that's another capability. I know a lot of customers were waiting on this one. That is out. And I'd kind of talked about this before. Network policy. This is a big release. Network policy for Calico on Windows. So, want to think of one of the first security kind of capabilities we're starting to layer in. The first of many to start coming in. But now, when you deploy a AKS cluster and you start, you have your system node pool or your system and your system node pool, and you start adding in Windows node pools, you can deploy Calico into that, and those policy constructs will lay across that environment from a singular perspective. So really, really slick, especially if you're starting to mix blend your cluster, even if you're doing it singularly, but now Calico is all streamlined across the stack. And then for anybody who's kind of looking at, simplifying how they get into AKS, Azure Migrate has some pretty cool features around basically taking your VMs, containerizing them, and sticking them in AKS. So some pretty cool features you can look at there as well. Any questions on the public preview capabilities? All right, so what are we working on now is the next things. So NodePool start stop. So we have a start stop capability, which we just went GA, if anybody's familiar with that, but that's essentially starting and stopping at the cluster level. But what if you just want to stop a specific node pool, have a little bit higher level of granularity in there? That's kind of one of the next things we'll be tackling in from a capability point of view across the start stop feature set. We're also working on HTTP proxy settings. So we've heard feedback, have quite a few AKS issues on this one. Customers that have a proxy in front of their environment instead of a standardized firewall. So this gives you that choice, that flexibility. So if you do want to basically route all your traffic through the proxy, now that'll just be a parameter you pass to your cluster and basically have your proxy configuration there that all the nodes will essentially route through. For your secrets management with 1.20 as well, we're working hard to complete the secret story that we have from end to end. So depending on how you as an organization want to use secrets, we obviously have, all the CSI drivers that I talked about before that are going GA in 1.20, but we're also working on Secret Store CSI as an example. So that's an upstream capability right now, but we're bringing that in as a managed component. That will actually be public preview, hopefully by the end of the month, as we're kind of working through. Lastly, one of the big things we're working on is obviously when you AAD enable a cluster, and we have this very robust identity story for how you can build in least privilege access, just-in-time access, conditional access I talked about before. With all of that, you still have this backdoor of doing --admin when you do your Git credentials, right? And then just bypassing the identity structure and going right into the local accounts. And so what this feature will actually do is when you AAD enable your cluster, it'll actually disable the local accounts, right? And so that's an election-based capability. So think of doing AZ AKS create, and then you'll say, enable AAD and then disable local accounts. You'll pass that as a parameter, and then say as an example, think like break glass. Then you can just run an AZ AKS upgrade and then enable local accounts as an example. But that's going to be another capability that will kind of really complete that identity story for us. Think about billing. So I talked about the start-stop capability. So cluster scale-down policy, another big thing that's going to come in there. Teleport, a really cool one. So for anybody on the call who's not familiar with our teleporting feature, think of for like your really large VMs when you're basically doing a pod deployment and you're basically waiting for that image to be pulled from the registry. And really what teleport's doing is caching everything. So it really speeds up the deployment process, the deployment pipeline for your image topology, most notably your very large, robust images. Scale is another one we kind of hear, right? So Google has this, Amazon has this, where's AKS on this? So we're constantly working on the networking side on different components to introduce additional scale. So we're obviously working with our new CNI updates. We're working on some, I'll talk about some load balancer stuff we're doing as well. We're going to be increasing that support structure that we have, the limitations that we have. We're constantly looking to push those limits up. Support different options for Docker root location. So this is really about customization, event grid integration. Oh, I got outer tree provider in there twice. For your private clusters, one of the challenges a lot of customers had is around how do I integrate, how do I talk to my network, to my kubelet on my private cluster? So do I jump host in? Do I bastion host in? Am I on the network? What if I'm off the network? As an example, I need to get into my cluster. So what this really is think of this like a kubectl export based feature, right? And so the idea there is now you don't need a jump host, you don't need a bastion host. You can just basically run an AZ command, and it'll basically shell your kubectl access back into your private cluster. For anybody who's fighting with service meshes, we've heard a lot of feedback about Istio's hard, console stops here. Linkerd does this. Really, we need like a streamlined, integrated, easy to set up based service mesh. So we, from the upstream team, have been working really hard on OSM, which is open service mesh. Very straightforward what it is, but it's designed exactly to be a streamlined, simplified, easy to integrate based service mesh, and that's coming to AKS as a managed add-on. So you deploy a cluster, hit a button, and it lays your service mesh down on your cluster as well for you to start segmenting out. Node image upgrade for node versions, right? So working to make that that harder. So think one of the big points that we want to get across is we're working really hard to make AKS more of a managed PaaS service, right? So less interaction needed. So one of the big pain points customers have is node image upgrades. Do I use KuberD? Do I do node image upgrades? How do I manage my patches? How do I maintain my versions? We're working to kind of simplify that story for everybody as well. Enabling GitOps, right? So essentially starting to make the development integration more streamlined as well. More to come on that front, but GitOps is going to be one of the first things we're doing, bridge to AKS, other things we're doing around that as well, to really streamline the DevOps experience into the cluster. Kind of mentioned Containerd on Windows. Obviously, if you're deploying a 1.19 cluster, 1.18 to 1.19 is kind of pivoting from Docker to Containerd. But on the Windows front, Windows is still running on Docker. And so once they get this work done, now Windows will be running on Containerd, and we'll have static across the Windows and Linux-based environment. I mentioned the security front, so bringing Windows AKS into Azure Security Center. So there's a lot of things coming down the pipeline. So you think ACR scans Linux containers, and very soon in the next month or two, it'll be scanning Windows containers as well. So that will bring it in, and then there's some Defender stuff that we're doing as well that I can probably talk about on the next call. So propagation of user-assigned identities to every dependent resource used by the AKS cluster. And then lastly, kind of rounding it out, as zones are coming in, we're starting to continue to do the zone work. So South Africa, we've had a lot of customers asking for this. So South Africa North zone support and Brazil South support. Yep, and I thought I did the last column. Yep, for the planned. All right, so how am I doing on time? Am I still tracking good on time? I got one last column to kind of run through. All right. So lastly, as we get into like the planned commit, what are we kind of working on? Next month we'll be picking up integrating Dapper as an add-on. We're also working on even simplified DNS for private clusters. So think public DNS for private clusters, as an example. This is kind of one thing that we're kind of working there, and really just kind of hopefully really closing out the different options customers have for working with their private clusters. I talked about the scale work that we're doing. One of the limiting points that we had was around the load balancer, right? So now we're going to be adding in support to scale out your load balancers. So now, as I build node pools, the idea there is as I build the node pools, I'll be able to associate a load balancer with that node pool, right? And so now I can start to linearly scale my environment, getting well past the 1,000 node, whatever it might be. More to come on that front. Obviously, I just talked about 120, 1.21 will be in there. Node auto drain. We're going to be releasing alpha clusters. So for customers that want to play with the alpha features in Kubernetes, this will be, think of this as a cordoned off environment. You won't be able to upgrade it or anything like that. I think stovepipe would be a better way to say that. But the idea there is that this gives customers a way to play with the alpha features before they get ready to pump into the environment. NAT Gateway is an outbound type, is coming as well. Reconcile all system labeling is another big feature we're working on. AKS deployments, we're working on West US 3, Azure Central, India West, and India Central. We talked about a lot of stuff coming through CNI. Kubernetes is going to get the same thing. Allow creation of node pools in different subnets is a big one. Enable retrieval of supported skews. So right now, one of the things we're working on is essentially we got to do a lot of work to basically bring in the skews, and think of it now as the compute team releases a new skew, it'll just be automatically available within AKS for the customer base to consume. Support creating AKS cluster by specifying only Kubernetes miners version. So think of this as you rolling through the different versions, giving you a higher level of granularity for how that works. Bringing Pod Identity, all the work we've been doing on Pod Identity over to the Windows environment. That's another big thing we're working on as well. The ability to install InfiniBand, zone support for West US 3. Another big thing we're working on the security front is signature story, right? So everybody's probably familiar with content trust. And one of the things we're working on here, especially with Containerd in the conversation, is signature validation. So think building an image, basically associating a signature with that build, caching that image on the registry doing signature validation, and then when you do the deployment validating that you're deploying from a trusted source, right, based off of that signature. And so think of that end-to-end signature validation story. That's really what Notary V2 is about. And so we are doing some work, and then we've planned. So on the ACR side, they're working through that work right now, and then we will add some hooks on our side. Think policy verification for the deployment out onto the AKS cluster based off of that signature being validated or not validated. KMS. So if from a secret perspective, if you're choosing from a deployment perspective to let your secrets be leveraged inside of the cluster itself in the etcd directory, obviously that's there in a non-encrypted plain text-based format. And so we have KMS, which is a encryption of that. And so that'll integrate with Key Vault, and so it'll basically CMK enable that that etcd directory, and then stash the secrets for that encryption in Key Vault. So that is an open source contribution that exists today, and we're going to be working to bring that in as a managed add-on within AKS. Hyper-V isolation, GMSA v2 support on Windows. Sweden deploying in South and Central. All right, I know I ran through a ton of capabilities. Anything else that any questions that anybody has?
I know there's been a lot of activity in the chat. I don't know if there's any of those. It seems like George done a good job going through those, but just want to encourage everyone, this is a good opportunity to ask questions around what was covered, or just any other questions that maybe you wouldn't have the opportunity to ask at other times. So I'll just encourage people to take advantage while you can.
Hi, yeah, I had one. Oh, sorry, go on.
I apologize. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I just had a question about Pod Identities and the V2 version that was mentioned. I was wondering if there's a timeline available for that, when that's sort of going to be available in preview or GA.
Yeah, so what we're working through is essentially the plan is that's why V1 is staying in preview. So we're working hard to get V2 in. The plan will be is that by the end of Q2, the plan is for greenfield environments, you'll be able to deploy V2 into a cluster and then basically set the end-to-end identity story, right? And so that will be in private preview. We'll start kicking with some customers there. But then in Q3, what we're working on is an MSI SDK capability that will allow that you can now run V1 and V2 in parallel, and then V2 will consume the identities from V1, and then basically V2 will be the authority for those identities. And so what we suspect is probably a public preview of that will be in Q3, and then we'll be working to GA that from there. So whether or not we can do it in Q4 or Q1 of 2022, that's still up for debate, but at least everybody should be able to kick the tires on it from a greenfield perspective in late Q2. And then obviously for the brownfield scenarios where you're already running V1, you can run that in parallel, test the migration in Q3.
Thanks. That's right.
So what kind of support you guys are adding for Java developer, right? For the local development. I saw you have a bridge to Kubernetes and then Dapper on Kubernetes.
Yep.
Do you have anything planned or already in place, something that Java developers can use?
So Quentin, are you on? Did you want to chime in there? If not, I can take it. Oh, okay. So yeah. So what we're trying to do is obviously streamline and simplify the bridge into Kubernetes, right? So obviously with Spring Cloud capabilities and those kind of things like that, there's definitely some work coming in. I don't know if we have anything specific for Java in that regard. Did you have something you were thinking about that you would like to see?
I would like to see dev space. I kind of found that interesting. Scaffold. I don't know if we can even do that integration, but those are the two interesting ones that I saw.
Okay, so we could definitely take that as feedback.
Yeah, and I will say, from a dev spaces perspective, like, are you thinking of kind of the initial, we came out with dev spaces and that's changed to bridge to Kubernetes? Is that what to dev spaces? So essentially think of just from the context that I have, we started out with Azure Dev Spaces, and then we will have a session on Bridge in a couple weeks, so I definitely recommend joining that. But I think Dev Spaces was a bit more opinionated in terms of like developers having to know about Kubernetes paradigms, right? Because you're still having to containerize the local code. And so from a Java perspective or other languages, that should be supported in the new bridge, but that's basically where we're going. So dev spaces will essentially be phased out I guess in conjunction with bridge to Kubernetes being further and more deeply integrated. So that's kind of the story, at least from a dev spaces perspective. And I know that they're working to have bridge to Kubernetes integrated with Dapper. So if you were using Dapper and bridge, they could, you could get that similar debugging experience. And then in terms of like other dev tooling, I think that session will be good for covering some of that. I know that we had, scaffold, tilt, things like that can integrate pretty well regardless of where Kubernetes is running. So I'm happy to send out some further information on some of that, what's happening there.
Yeah, that'd be great. I was talking about there is a dev space tool which is kind of different from the dev spaces that AKS had integrated. So I was talking about that one.
Okay.
So another thing is like you guys support for the Kubernetes bridge to Kubernetes. You support Visual Studio, right? I was just thinking like, what do you support from the Java perspective? Like,
yeah, so it's Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, but they're working to support other IDEs as well. So that they have a public roadmap on the Bridge to Kubernetes GitHub page, and one of the ones that's currently in progress is support for other IDEs.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? that didn't already get asked in the chat? I know George answered most of them, but I'm looking through and seeing what else I can answer for everybody. So Richard asked about teleport for Windows. Not yet, but that is in the plans. Yep. Oh, George, I did see George did answer that. Thanks, George. So let's see. So any other lingering questions that did not get answered? All right, Kendall, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, it looks like there's a question around open service mesh for Windows containers.
So I know that,
front?
yeah, so I know the upstream team is working on that. I don't have off the top of my head an ETA for when that is, but I know that's something that's planned.
Yeah, I would say it's got to be a little ways out, because what it really relies on is Envoy proxy supporting Windows containers, and that's very early alpha at this point.
Yep. All right.
Awesome. Well, that's all we had planned for today. We really wanted to be able to kind of get this overview for all of you. Hopefully it was useful. At the beginning of the next session, we'll definitely make sure to get some feedback. Right now would be a good time too. If there's other things that you'd like to see in these calls, or, if the format worked well, please feel free to drop that or reach out to us directly, Dave and myself. We want to make sure that these are super useful, but, just a big thank you to Michael and George. And, if there's other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and they can get back to you. But that's basically all we had for today. So we'll give you a few minutes back.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us in.
All righty, everyone. We'll see you at the next session. Thanks.
Thank you.